Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. There's a moment in every country's history when isolated incidents stop feeling isolated, when something that should be shocking starts to feel familiar. And when that happens, the real danger isn't just the event itself, it's what it reveals about the direction the country is heading. What happened at the White House Correspondents Dinner wasn't just a failed assassination attempt, it wasn't just another security scare. And it definitely wasn't just a headline that will fade in a few news cycles. It was something deeper, a snapshot of a system under pressure, a society becoming more volatile, and a political environment where extremes are no longer confined to the margins. Think about the setting for a second. This wasn't a campaign rally, it wasn't a protest, it wasn't even a controversial policy announcement. This was one of the most symbolic events in Washington, the annual dinner where politicians, journalists, and public figures gather in the same room. A place that, at least in theory, represents a kind of uneasy truce between power and scrutiny. A space built on the idea that disagreement doesn't have to lead to destruction. And yet, just outside that room, a man armed with multiple weapons attempted to break through security, engage federal agents, and potentially carry out a targeted political attack. That contrast matters, because it tells you something fundamental. The distance between political disagreement and political violence is shrinking. Now, let's be clear about one thing. The individual involved in this case, highly educated, seemingly functional, not previously on law enforcement's radar, does not fit the traditional stereotype of a violent extremist. This wasn't someone operating from a remote compound or part of an organized militia. This was someone who moved through normal social structures, who had a career, who participated in civic life. And yet, he ended up writing a manifesto justifying political assassination. That should force us to ask a much harder question than what happened. The real question is, how does someone get there? Because the answer to that question isn't about one person, it's about a pattern. In recent years, we've seen a steady erosion of the boundaries that used to define acceptable political behavior. Language has become more absolute. Opponents are no longer just wrong, they're illegitimate, corrupt, even evil. And once you cross that line, once you start seeing political opponents, not as competitors, but as existential threats, the logic begins to change. If your opponent is simply wrong, you debate them. If your opponent is corrupt, you investigate them. But if your opponent is evil, truly dangerous to the country, then in the minds of some people, extreme actions start to feel justified. That's the psychological shift that matters. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's built over time, reinforced by media ecosystems, amplified by algorithms, and normalized by rhetoric that rewards outrage over nuance. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. Because it's easy to treat this kind of attack as an anomaly, as the act of a disturbed individual, disconnected from broader society. And to some extent, that's true. Personal responsibility matters, mental instability can play a role. But stopping there misses the bigger picture. What we're seeing is not just individual radicalization, it's systemic acceleration. People are not radicalizing in isolation anymore. They're doing it in environments that validate, reinforce, and escalate their beliefs. Online spaces where extreme interpretations are not challenged but encouraged. Where every piece of information is filtered through a lens of distrust. Where institutions are not just criticized, but fundamentally delegitimized. And once that process takes hold, reality itself becomes negotiable. Facts become opinions. Opponents become enemies. And violence becomes, in some minds, a form of justice. That's the first half of the story. But the second half is just as important and arguably more consequential in the long run. Because what happens after an event like this is not just about investigation or accountability, it's about response. And response, in politics, is never neutral. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the reaction followed a familiar pattern: praise for law enforcement, calls for unity, emphasis on resilience. All of that is expected, and in many ways, appropriate. But almost immediately, the conversation began to shift. From what happened to what needs to be done. And that's where things start to get complicated. Because crises don't just demand responses, they create opportunities. There's a well-known phrase in politics: never waste a crisis. It's often attributed to Rahm Emanuel, but the idea goes back much further. The basic principle is simple: moments of fear and uncertainty create space for decisions that might not be possible under normal conditions. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Within hours, the discussion expanded beyond the incident itself. It moved into questions of infrastructure, funding, and long-term security planning. Proposals that had previously faced resistance suddenly gained urgency. Legal challenges that had stalled certain projects were reframed as obstacles to national safety. In particular, the push for a new high-security presidential event space, something that had been debated, delayed, and contested, was brought back into focus. Not as a luxury or a political preference, but as a necessity. The argument is straightforward. If existing venues can't guarantee safety, then new ones must be built. On the surface, that makes sense. But here's the question that doesn't get asked often enough. Are we solving the right problem? Because there's a difference between addressing vulnerabilities and expanding systems. If the issue is a security lapse, gaps in screening, coordination failures, intelligence breakdowns, then the solution should focus on fixing those specific weaknesses. But if the response is to build entirely new structures, allocate massive new funding, and expand institutional authority, then we're no longer just reacting, we're transforming. And transformation always comes with trade-offs. This is where the tension between security and restraint becomes critical. History gives us plenty of examples of how crises reshape governance. After 9/11, the United States passed the Patriot Act, dramatically expanding surveillance capabilities. Entire agencies were reorganized. New powers were granted, often with limited oversight, because the threat environment demanded speed and decisiveness. At the time, those decisions were widely supported, and in many ways, they were effective in preventing further large-scale attacks. But over time, concerns emerged about privacy, about overreach, about the long-term implications of temporary measures becoming permanent structures. That's the pattern to watch. Because what begins as a response to a specific threat can evolve into a broader shift in how power is exercised. And once those changes are in place, they rarely go away. Now, to be fair, the current situation is not the same as post-9/11 America. The scale is different, the context is different, but the underlying mechanism, the way crisis interacts with policy, is remarkably consistent. Fear creates urgency. Urgency lowers resistance. And lowered resistance enables expansion. That doesn't mean every response is wrong. It doesn't mean every proposal is unnecessary. Security is a legitimate concern, especially when high-level officials are targeted. But it does mean that every response should be examined carefully. Because there's another layer to this story, one that connects the two halves we've been discussing. Political radicalization and institutional expansion are not separate phenomena, they feed into each other. When society becomes more polarized, the risk of violence increases. When violence increases, the demand for security rises. When security expands, it can deepen mistrust, especially among those who already feel alienated. And that mistrust, in turn, can fuel further radicalization. It's a loop, a feedback cycle that, if left unchecked, can push a system into a more unstable equilibrium. So the real challenge is not just stopping the next attack, it's breaking the cycle. And that's much harder, because it requires addressing root causes, not just symptoms. It means asking uncomfortable questions about political rhetoric on all sides, about how leaders frame their opponents, about how media amplifies conflict, about how technology shapes perception. It means recognizing that security alone cannot solve a problem that is, at its core, social and psychological. You can harden buildings, you can increase surveillance, you can deploy more personnel, but none of that changes the mindset of someone who believes violence is justified. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The United States is not facing a single threat. It's facing a convergence of pressures, political, cultural, informational, that are reshaping how conflict is understood and expressed. In that environment, events like this are not anomalies, they're signals, warnings that something deeper is shifting. Now, there's one more aspect worth considering: the role of leadership. In moments like this, the tone set by leaders matters enormously, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of narrative. Calls for unity are important, but unity is not just about standing together in the aftermath of a crisis. It's about how disagreements are handled before the crisis occurs. If political competition continues to be framed in existential terms, if every election is described as a battle for survival, if every opponent is portrayed as a threat to the nation, then the conditions that enable radicalization will persist. And no amount of security infrastructure can fully compensate for that. On the other hand, if there's a shift toward de-escalation, toward recognizing legitimacy even in opposition, toward rebuilding a baseline of trust, then the trajectory can change. But that requires restraint, and restraint is difficult in a system that rewards intensity. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a moment of choice. Not a dramatic, single decision, but a series of smaller choices about how to interpret events, about how to respond to them, about whether to focus on immediate fixes or long-term stability. The attempted attack at the Correspondents' Dinner will be investigated, policies will be proposed, debates will take place. All of that is expected, but the deeper question is whether the underlying dynamics will be addressed or simply managed. Because managing a problem is not the same as solving it. And if the current trajectory continues, if polarization deepens, if violence becomes more normalized, if every crisis leads to further expansion without reflection, then the system may become more secure in some ways, but also more fragile in others. More protected, but less cohesive. More controlled, but less trusted. That's the paradox. And it's not unique to one administration, one party, or one moment. It's structural. So the takeaway is not about assigning blame, it's about recognizing patterns, understanding that what happened is part of something larger, that the response will shape not just the next few weeks, but the broader direction of the country. And that in moments like this, the most important decisions are not always the most visible ones. They're the ones that determine whether a society moves towards stability or continues down a path where crisis and reaction become the norm. Because once that becomes the norm, the real danger isn't just the next attack. It's the gradual redefinition of what feels normal. And by the time that shift is fully recognized, it's often already too late. Thanks for watching.